The autumn morning arrived cold and gray over Asheville, North Carolina, when Dr. Sarah Mitchell first laid eyes on the photograph that would consume the next 6 months of her life. As the lead conservator at the Southern Appalachian Heritage Center, she had restored hundreds of 19th-century photographs, but this one felt different from the moment the archive assistant placed the deteriorated tin case on her examination table. The case itself bore the marks of over a century of handling, its leather worn smooth in places where anxious fingers had opened and closed it countless times. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, lay a 6-plate daguerreotype that had somehow survived 136 years in the humid mountain climate. The image showed what appeared to be a typical Appalachian family from the late 1880s. A man and woman stood rigid before the camera, their faces bearing the stern expressions common to an era when photography required subjects to remain motionless for extended exposures. The man wore a dark wool suit that appeared well-maintained despite obvious age, his beard full and neatly trimmed in the fashion of the time. The woman beside him was dressed in her Sunday best, a dark dress with a high collar adorned with a simple brooch, her hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hardness around her eyes and mouth. Between them, barely visible in the faded image, stood what appeared to be a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, his hand resting on his father's arm. Sarah began the standard documentation process, photographing the daguerreotype from multiple angles under different lighting conditions before beginning the delicate work of cleaning and stabilization. The piece had suffered significant tarnishing, a common problem with daguerreotypes exposed to sulfur compounds in the air. Silver particles had oxidized over the decades, creating a hazy veil over the original image. Using specialized techniques developed over years of conservation work, she carefully began the restoration process, working under high magnification to reveal details hidden beneath layers of time and environmental damage. 3 weeks into the restoration, during a routine examination under raking light, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Between the parents, slightly behind the young boy, there appeared to be an anomaly in the image, a density variation that didn't match the expected degradation pattern. At first, she dismissed it as a flaw in the original plate or perhaps damage from improper storage. But as she continued working, carefully removing tarnish and stabilizing the fragile silver surface, the anomaly became more pronounced. It wasn't damage at all. It was another figure. The realization came slowly, then all at once. As Sarah increased the magnification and adjusted the lighting angle, she could make out the unmistakable shape of a small child standing between the parents, positioned slightly behind and to the left of the older boy. The figure was fainter than the other family members, as if the child had moved during the long exposure or had been deliberately positioned in shadow. But it was undeniably there, a fourth member of this family who had been nearly lost to time and deterioration. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she documented her finding. In her 15 years of photographic conservation, she had encountered hidden details before, faces obscured by damage or figures barely visible in poorly exposed plates. But this felt different. The positioning of this child, the way the image had been composed, suggested something more complex than simple photographic technique. The child appeared to be approximately 5 or 6 years old, dressed in what looked like a simple white gown, the kind commonly used for young children of both genders in that era. The face was turned slightly away from the camera, making identification of gender or specific features difficult even after restoration. What troubled Sarah most was the expression on the parents' faces. Now that she could see the full family composition, their rigid postures took on new meaning. The father's hand, which she had initially thought was resting protectively on the older boy's shoulder, now appeared to be gripping with visible tension. The mother's eyes, which had seemed merely stern in the original viewing, now looked haunted, fixed on a point beyond the camera with an intensity that suggested barely contained emotion. The daguerreotype had arrived at the center as part of a larger estate donation from the descendants of the Thornton family, prominent landowners in the mountainous regions of western North Carolina during the late 19th century. The donation included several dozen photographs, numerous letters, ledgers, and personal documents spanning 3 generations. Sarah pulled the accompanying documentation, searching for any reference to the image or the family members it depicted. The notation was sparse, a small card in faded ink that read simply, Thornton family, October 1889, photographer unknown, location, presumed Madison County. Sarah spent the remainder of that afternoon searching through the estate collection, looking for any mention of the Thornton family in 1889. The ledgers from that period showed typical entries for a farming family of moderate means: purchases of seed and livestock, sales of timber and crops, payments to laborers during harvest season. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the strange composition of the family portrait or the nearly invisible child standing between the parents as evening fell and the center prepared to close. Sarah made the decision to pursue this mystery further. She contacted Dr. James Whitmore, a historian specializing in Appalachian social history at the nearby university. If anyone could help her understand the context of this photograph and identify the family members, it would be him. She sent him high-resolution scans of both the original deteriorated image and her partially restored version, along with what little documentation existed. His response came within hours, arriving in her email inbox just as she was preparing dinner in her small apartment overlooking the French Broad River. The subject line read simply, "This is extraordinary." In the message, James explained that he had been researching Appalachian family structures and mortality rates in the late 19th century for a forthcoming book. The Thornton family name was familiar to him from census records and county documents. He had references to a Samuel Thornton, his wife Martha, and their children in various records from the 1880s and 1890s. What intrigued him most was the timing of the photograph. October 1889 had been a particularly brutal month in the North Carolina mountains. An early winter storm had swept through the region, bringing heavy snow and bitter cold that caught many families unprepared. The winter that followed was remembered in local histories as one of the harshest on record. Crop failures, livestock losses, and widespread illness had devastated the mountain communities. County death records from that period showed a significant spike in mortality, particularly among children and the elderly. James suggested they meet the following morning to examine the photograph together and search through the more extensive archives housed at the university. Sarah agreed, her curiosity now fully engaged. That night, she found herself unable to sleep, her mind returning again and again to the image of that small figure standing in shadow between its parents, present yet somehow absent, there yet not there, captured by the camera but nearly erased by time. The university's Special Collections Library occupied the entire third floor of an aging brick building on the western edge of campus, its tall windows overlooking the mountains that rose in successive ridges toward Tennessee. Sarah arrived early, before the building officially opened, and found James already waiting in the entrance hall, two large boxes of materials stacked on a cart beside him. He had spent the previous evening pulling every document related to the Thornton family and Madison County from the late 1880s, he explained as he led her through the security checkpoint and into the climate-controlled reading room. They worked methodically through the materials, starting with census records. The 1880 federal census listed Samuel Thornton, age 28, farmer, living in Madison County with his wife Martha, age 26, and their son William, age 3. The family's property was valued modestly, suggesting they were neither wealthy nor destitute, typical of many Appalachian farming families who owned their land but struggled with the challenges of mountain agriculture. By the 1890 census, the family composition had changed. Samuel and Martha were still listed, now with William, age 13, but there was no mention of any other children. This absence was significant. Census takers in rural areas were often inconsistent, and families might underreport children for various reasons, but the complete lack of any other child in the 1890 record suggested either that no other children had been born or that any who had been born had not survived to be counted. Given the high infant and child mortality rates of the period, the latter seemed more likely. James pulled out a thick ledger containing transcribed death records from Madison County between 1885 and 1895. The records were incomplete, he warned, as many rural deaths went unrecorded, particularly if they occurred during winter months when travel to the county seat was difficult or impossible. But what records existed painted a grim picture of life in the mountains during this period. Page after page listed children dead from scarlet fever, diphtheria, pneumonia, whooping cough, and dozens of other illnesses that would become preventable in later decades. The entries were stark and businesslike, name, age, cause of death, date, and sometimes a brief notation about burial location. Sarah worked through the pages carefully, searching for any Thornton entries. She found it on page 47, a single line that made her catch her breath. Thornton, Emma Jane, female, age 5 years, 8 months. Died October 19, 1889. Cause, pneumonia. Buried, family plot, Shelton Laurel. The date stopped her cold. October 1889, the same month and year as the daguerreotype. She called James over, and together they stared at the entry, the implications slowly becoming clear. The photograph hadn't captured a complete, living family. It had been taken at a specific moment, during or immediately after a tragedy that would mark the family forever. The faint figure of the child between the parents wasn't simply an artifact of long exposure or poor lighting. It was Emma, captured by the camera perhaps days or even hours before her death, or possibly even after, in one of the post-mortem photographs common in that era. James began pulling additional materials, searching for any contemporaneous accounts that might shed light on the circumstances. He found references in a local minister's journal, housed in the Theological Seminary's archives and recently digitized. Reverend Thomas Blackwell had served the scattered mountain communities around Shelton Laurel from 1885 to 1894, traveling by horse through rugged terrain to bring religious services to families who might see a minister only a few times a year. His journal entries were detailed, recording not just religious matters but the daily struggles and tragedies of his congregation. The entry for October 1889 made for difficult reading. Reverend Blackwell described arriving in Shelton Laurel to find the community reeling from the early winter storm. Several families had lost livestock, and many were woefully unprepared for the harsh weather that had arrived weeks earlier than expected. He had been called to the Thornton home to attend to their youngest child, Emma, who had fallen ill with what appeared to be pneumonia. The description was clinical yet compassionate, noting the child's difficulty breathing, the fever that wouldn't break, and the parents' desperate attempts to save their daughter with the limited medical knowledge and resources available in that remote location. The Reverend had stayed with the family for 3 days, praying with them and offering what comfort he could. His journal entry for October 19th was brief. Emma Thornton passed into the Lord's arms this morning at dawn. The family is broken with grief. Samuel refuses to speak. Martha weeps without ceasing. Young William seems lost, unable to comprehend his sister's absence. I have agreed to conduct the service tomorrow, though the ground will be hard to break for burial. But it was the entry for October 20th that provided the crucial detail Sarah and James had been seeking. Reverend Blackwell wrote, "Before the burial, Samuel insisted on taking the family to Asheville to have a photograph made. He has become fixed on this idea, saying he needs a record of his family complete before Emma is laid in the ground." Martha protested, saying it was unseemly, but Samuel would not be moved. They departed before dawn with Emma's body wrapped and preserved in the cold. I worry for this family's state of mind. The implications were staggering. The daguerreotype hadn't captured a living family at all, or rather, it had captured a family with one member already dead. The practice of post-mortem photography was common in the Victorian era, a way for families to have a final image of deceased loved ones, particularly children. But this photograph was different. The Thorntons had traveled with their dead daughter to have a family portrait made, positioning her body between them as if she were still alive, still part of their living family. The faintness of Emma's figure in the image might have been a deliberate choice by the photographer, a way to acknowledge her death while still including her in the family composition, or it might have been simply the result of the difficulty in positioning a lifeless body to remain stable during the long exposure required by daguerreotype technology. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she considered the desperation and grief that must have driven Samuel Thornton to make such a journey. The trip from Shelton Laurel to Asheville would have taken at least a full day by wagon over rough mountain roads, carrying the body of their dead child in the October cold. The determination to have this photograph made, to create this one lasting record of their family as it had been, spoke to a depth of loss that transcended the century and a half since the image was created. James began searching for additional records, looking for any further information about the Thornton family after 1889. Property records showed that Samuel had sold portions of his land in 1890 and 1891, suggesting financial difficulties. By 1892, the family appeared to have left Madison County entirely, with the remaining property sold to a neighbor. Census records from 1900 showed Samuel and Martha Thornton living in Knoxville, Tennessee, where Samuel worked as a laborer rather than farming. William appeared in the same census, now 23 and working in a textile mill. There was no mention of any other children ever born to Samuel and Martha after Emma's death. The trail grew colder after 1900. Martha appeared in a death record from 1904, buried in a Knoxville cemetery. Samuel lived until 1918, dying in a boarding house at age 66, his death certificate listing his occupation as retired and his estate as negligible. William married in 1905 but appeared to have no children. The Thornton line, at least this branch, ended with him in 1947. That Sarah spent the next several days completing the restoration of the daguerreotype, working with new purpose now that she understood what she was revealing. She used the gentlest techniques possible, mindful that she was not just restoring an image but honoring a family's grief and love. As the tarnish cleared and the image emerged with increasing clarity, Emma's figure became more distinct, though still maintaining that ghostly quality that set her apart from her parents and brother. The child's face remained turned slightly away, and Sarah realized that this had probably been necessary to hide the changes death had already brought to Emma's features. When the restoration was complete, Sarah arranged for the daguerreotype to be properly rehoused in an archival case with documentation explaining what she and James had discovered. The photograph would be included in an upcoming exhibition about Appalachian family life in the 19th century, and Sarah had written an extensive accompanying text explaining the historical context and the story behind the image. But she insisted that the family's grief be respected, that Emma's death and her parents' desperate act of love be presented with the dignity and compassion it deserved. Sarah couldn't let the story rest with the archived documents and restored photograph. Something about the Thorntons' journey, about Samuel's determination to have that photograph made, demanded deeper understanding. She had restored the image, had uncovered the basic facts of Emma's death and the family's subsequent dissolution, but she felt she was still missing something essential about these people and their loss. In late November, as winter began to settle over western North Carolina once again, Sarah made the decision to visit Shelton Laurel. She contacted a local historian who worked with the Madison County Historical Society, a woman named Dorothy Ramsey who had spent decades documenting the area's families and preserving their stories. Dorothy was familiar with the Thornton name. She told Sarah over the phone and agreed to meet her and show her the area where the family had lived and farmed. The drive from Asheville took Sarah deep into the mountains, along winding roads that climbed through successive ridges, each turn revealing vistas of forested peaks stretching to the horizon. Shelton Laurel was not so much a town as a valley, a collection of homes and farms scattered along a creek that rushed through the hollow. Dorothy met Sarah at a small church that stood at a crossroads, its white clapboard siding bright against the gray November sky. Dorothy was in her 70s, a retired schoolteacher who had grown up in these mountains and never left. She knew the land and its history intimately, could point to a particular ridge and tell you which family had farmed it for 5 generations, could identify the ruins of old homesteads hidden in second-growth forest. She had brought copies of old property maps and several notebooks filled with family genealogies and oral histories she had collected over the years. They drove further up the valley, the road becoming narrower and rougher until they reached a place where Dorothy pulled over onto a wide spot in the gravel. They continued on foot, following an old trace that led up into the forest. The November air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. After about 20 minutes of walking, Dorothy stopped and pointed to what appeared at first to be just a jumble of mossy stones scattered among the trees. This had been the Thornton property, Dorothy explained. The foundation stones Sarah was looking at were all that remained of their cabin. The family had cleared perhaps 20 acres on this slope, growing corn and beans, keeping a few pigs and chickens, cutting timber to sell when they needed cash. It was hard land, Dorothy said, steep and rocky, prone to early frosts and erosion. Families who farmed these mountain slopes worked brutally hard for modest yields, their survival dependent on a combination of skill, determination, and luck. Dorothy led Sarah further up the slope to another clearing, this one more overgrown. Here, beneath a massive oak tree, was the family cemetery. The plot was small, surrounded by a low stone wall that had mostly collapsed. There were 6 gravestones, most so weathered that the inscriptions were barely legible. Dorothy pulled out a notebook where she had transcribed the stones years earlier, before weather had erased even more of the text. Emma's grave was marked by a small, simple stone, less ornate than those of adults but carefully carved nonetheless. The inscription read, Emma Jane Thornton, April 16, 1884 to October 19, 1889. Our beloved daughter. Gone to glory but not forgotten. Next to Emma's stone was another small marker for an infant, a brother or sister who had died before reaching a year old. 3 other stones marked adult graves, likely Samuel's parents and another relative. The newest stone, clearly added much later, marked the burial of William Thornton in 1947, brought back to the mountains from wherever he had spent his final years. Sarah stood in the small cemetery for a long time, imagining the funeral that October day in 1889. Reverend Blackwell's journal had mentioned that the ground was hard to break for burial, the early cold having already begun to freeze the earth. She imagined Samuel and Martha standing where she now stood, William beside them, watching as their youngest child was lowered into the mountain soil. And then she imagined them leaving, traveling through the mountains to Asheville, Emma's body with them, determined to create one last family portrait before her physical presence disappeared forever. Dorothy shared what oral history she had collected about the Thorntons over the years. The family was remembered, though not particularly well. Samuel had been regarded as a capable farmer but also as somewhat distant, not given to socializing or participating much in the community gatherings that bound mountain families together. Martha had been seen as sad, one elderly informant had told Dorothy years ago, always sad even before the little girl died. William had been remembered as a bright child who had helped his father with the farming but had left as soon as he was old enough, apparently eager to escape the mountains and the memories they held. The story of Emma's death and the photograph had been preserved in fragments among the older families. Several people Dorothy had interviewed remembered hearing their grandparents or great-grandparents mention the Thornton family who had taken their dead child to have a picture made. The story had been told as an example of grief driving people to strange actions, though most who told it admitted they understood the impulse. In an era when death was ever-present and photographs were rare and precious, the desire to have some lasting image of a lost child made perfect sense, even if the method seemed macabre by later standards. One detail Dorothy shared struck Sarah with particular force. An elderly woman, now deceased, had told Dorothy that her grandmother had been present at Emma's funeral. According to family lore, Martha Thornton had become almost catatonic with grief during the service, unable to speak or move, supported by Samuel and a female relative. But when it came time to lower Emma into the grave, Martha had suddenly become animated, screaming that they had forgotten something, that something was missing. Samuel had to physically restrain her as she tried to climb into the grave itself. The woman's grandmother had believed Martha's mind had broken under the weight of her loss, that she was no longer fully rational. Others thought Martha had simply been a mother confronted with the finality of death and unable to accept it. Sarah asked about the daguerreotype specifically, whether anyone in the community had seen it or knew what became of it after the Thorntons left the area. Dorothy shook her head. As far as she knew, the photograph had left with the family. It had become a kind of local legend, the death portrait that had driven the Thorntons to such desperate measures, but no one she had interviewed had actually seen it. The fact that it had survived and made its way back to North Carolina through estate donations and archives was remarkable in itself. They spent the remainder of the afternoon walking the property, Dorothy pointing out features of 19th-century mountain life. The remains of a root cellar where the family would have stored vegetables and preserved food for winter, the outline of what had been a spring house built over a small seep to keep milk and other perishables cool, the traces of terracing where crops had been grown on the steep slope. It painted a picture of a family working hard to wrest a living from difficult land, their lives constrained by geography, limited resources, and the constant threat of illness and injury that characterized rural life in that era. Yes, they made their way back down to Dorothy's truck. The older woman shared one final piece of information. She had found in her research a letter written in 1920 by a cousin of Martha Thornton's, describing a visit to see Martha shortly before her death in 1904. The letter, housed in a private collection that Dorothy had been allowed to examine, mentioned that Martha had kept the daguerreotype displayed in her bedroom despite Samuel's objections. She would spend hours looking at it, the cousin wrote, talking to Emma as if the child were still present. The cousin had found this disturbing but also heartbreaking, a mother's inability to let go of a child she had lost too soon. Sarah drove back to Asheville as evening fell, the mountains darkening around her, the road descending through hollows where mist was already gathering. She thought about the Thorntons, about the life they had built in Shelton Laurel and the tragedy that had destroyed it. Emma's death hadn't just taken their youngest child, it had effectively ended their family. They had left the mountains, left the land that had been theirs, unable to continue living in the place where Emma was buried. Samuel and Martha's marriage had apparently endured, but the cousin's letter suggested it had been strained by grief and differing ways of processing loss. William had fled as soon as possible, never returning until his own death brought him back to be buried in the mountain soil. The exhibition opened on a cold Saturday in February at the Southern Appalachian Heritage Center. Sarah had worked for months on the installation, carefully curating a collection of photographs, documents, and artifacts that told the story of Appalachian family life in the late 19th century. But she knew, as did everyone involved with the project, that the Thornton daguerreotype would be the centerpiece, the image that would draw visitors and media attention. She had agonized over how to present the photograph and its story. The temptation was to sensationalize it, to focus on the macabre aspects of postmortem photography and the dramatic elements of a family traveling with their dead child. But Sarah had rejected that approach, working instead with James Whitmore and Dorothy Ramsey to create an interpretation that emphasized the human dimensions of loss, the desperation of parents facing their child's death, and the cultural context that made the photograph both unusual and understandable. The daguerreotype was displayed in a climate-controlled case with carefully calibrated lighting that protected the fragile image while allowing visitors to see the details Sarah had revealed. During restoration, beside it were displayed copies of the census records, Reverend Blackwell's journal entries, and the death certificate. A large panel explained the practice of postmortem photography in the Victorian era, with examples from the center's collection showing how families had memorialized deceased loved ones. Another panel described life in Shelton Laurel in 1889, the challenges of mountain farming, and the devastating impact of childhood mortality in rural areas. But the heart of the exhibition was Sarah's extended essay, printed on panels that guided visitors through the Thornton story. She had written it carefully, researching every detail, verifying every fact, but also allowing herself to acknowledge the emotional weight of what the daguerreotype represented. She described Samuel and Martha's journey to Asheville, imagined the photographer's reaction when he understood what was being asked of him, considered Emma's siblings and how they processed their sister's death and their parents' unusual memorial to her. The opening reception drew a larger crowd than the center had seen in years. Local media covered the story, and within days it had been picked up by regional and then national outlets. The combination of historical mystery, family tragedy, and the unsettling nature of the photograph captured public imagination. Sarah found herself giving numerous interviews, always careful to emphasize the historical context and human story rather than sensationalizing the more disturbing aspects of the image. The responses from visitors were varied and intense. Some were fascinated by the technical aspects of daguerreotype photography and postmortem portraiture, asking detailed questions about the process and Sarah's restoration work. Others were moved by the family's story, standing before the photograph for long minutes, some visibly emotional. A few were disturbed, questioning whether such an image should be displayed publicly, whether it violated Emma's dignity or exploited the family's grief. Sarah had anticipated these concerns and addressed them in her curatorial statement. The photograph, she argued, was a historical document that revealed important truths about how people confronted death and loss in a very different era. To hide it away would be to deny the Thorntons their voice, to suggest that their grief and their choices were somehow shameful rather than a testament to their love for their daughter. Emma had been a real child, loved and mourned, and this photograph was one of the few traces of her existence that had survived. To honor her memory meant acknowledging how her parents chose to remember her. 3 weeks after the exhibition opened, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 60s, well-dressed and carrying herself with quiet dignity, approached Sarah in the center's offices and introduced herself as Catherine Thornton Reynolds. She explained, the great-great-granddaughter of William Thornton, the boy standing beside his father in the daguerreotype. Catherine had seen the exhibition coverage in the news and had traveled from Virginia to see the photograph and learn more about her family's history. She knew very little about her Thornton ancestors, she admitted. William had apparently spoken little about his childhood or family, and Catherine's grandmother, William's daughter, had known almost nothing about her grandparents or the aunt who had died before her father left the mountains. Sarah spent several hours with Catherine, walking her through the exhibition and sharing everything she and James had discovered. Catherine was particularly moved by the photograph itself, standing before it with tears streaming down her face. These were her family members, people whose blood she carried, and she had never known they existed until now. The realization that Emma, this faint figure in the photograph, was her great-great-great-aunt, a child who had lived and died and been mourned, made the history suddenly, intensely personal. Catherine shared what little she knew about William's later life. He had moved to Knoxville, married a woman named Alice, and worked in textile mills for most of his adult life. He had been a quiet man, Catherine's grandmother had said, kind but distant, as if part of him was always somewhere else. He had never spoken about his childhood in the mountains or his parents or any siblings. When Catherine's grandmother had asked about his family, William had simply said they were all gone and changed the subject. He had never returned to North Carolina until his death in 1947, when his last request had been to be buried in the family plot in Shelton Laurel. Catherine asked if she could visit Shelton Laurel and see where her ancestors had lived. Sarah called Dorothy Ramsey, who agreed to meet them the following day and show Catherine the property and cemetery. The three women made the journey together, retracing the route Sarah had taken months earlier. Catherine stood in the small family cemetery, surrounded by the graves of people she had never known but who were nevertheless her family, her history. She placed flowers on Emma's grave, a gesture that seemed to close a circle of grief and memory that had been left open for over a century. In the weeks that followed, Catherine worked with Sarah and James to fill in more details of the family history. She provided photographs of William in his later years, a solemn man whose eyes held shadows that now made sense given what they knew about his childhood. She shared what few family stories had been passed down, small fragments that took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of Emma's death and the family's dissolution. The exhibition ran for 6 months, drawing steady crowds throughout its duration. It sparked academic interest, with several scholars of Appalachian history and photographic studies reaching out to Sarah and James to discuss the daguerreotype and its implications for understanding how families confronted loss in the 19th century. Plans were made for a scholarly article and possibly a book that would use the Thornton photograph as a case study for examining broader patterns of grief, memory, and memorial practices in rural America. For Sarah, the project had transformed from a routine restoration job into something profoundly meaningful. She had started with a deteriorated photograph and ended with a story that illuminated the lives of real people who had loved and suffered and tried to hold onto what mattered most to them. Emma Thornton had been dead for 136 years, but through the daguerreotype and the research it inspired, she had been brought back into living memory, her short life acknowledged and honored. The photograph remained on display even after the main exhibition closed, becoming part of the center's permanent collection. Visitors continued to seek it out, drawn by the story and by the haunting quality of the image itself. Some saw it as macabre, a disturbing relic of Victorian death culture. Others saw it as a testament to parental love, a family's refusal to let death erase their child from their story. Sarah thought both interpretations were valid, that the power of the image lay precisely in its ability to evoke such complex responses. On the anniversary of Emma's death, October 19th, Sarah and Catherine returned to Shelton Laurel together. They had made this an annual pilgrimage, a way of ensuring that Emma and her family were not forgotten, that their story continued to be told. They placed flowers on the small grave, stood quietly among the trees listening to the wind move through the mountains, and remembered a little girl who had lived briefly in these hills and whose death had echoed through generations. As they walked back down the mountain that afternoon, Catherine turned to Sarah and thanked her for giving her back her family. Before the restoration of the daguerreotype, Catherine had said her Thornton ancestors had been just names on a genealogy chart, abstract and distant. Now they were real people with real struggles and real love for each other. Emma's death had been a tragedy, but Samuel and Martha's decision to include her in that final family portrait had ensured that she would never be completely forgotten. The daguerreotype had survived, carrying their grief and love forward through time until someone like Sarah had the skill and compassion to reveal what had been hidden. Sarah watched the mountains recede in her rearview mirror as she drove home that evening. She thought about all the other photographs in archives and collections, each one holding stories waiting to be discovered, families waiting to be remembered. The work of restoration was technical, requiring chemistry and optics and meticulous care. But it was also an act of witness, a way of honoring the lives captured in those old images, of refusing to let time erase the evidence that they had existed, had loved, had mattered. The daguerreotype had been just a deteriorated image when it first crossed her examination table. Now it was a memorial, a piece of history, and a reminder that behind every old photograph is a human story worth knowing. Samuel and Martha Thornton had made their daughter Emma part of their family portrait even in death because they could not bear to imagine a record of their family without her. That act of love had preserved Emma's memory across more than a century, ensuring that she remained visible, present, remembered, even as a shadow between her parents in an 1889 photograph that had found its way home to the mountains where she was born and died and was never forgotten.